Hello all you beautiful people, my name is Zach Dowdy. Today we're going to be talking about how to do rock and rolls on transition, a trick that's really developed for me over the years. At first I just kind of tapped it, then I figured out how to lock it in. We're going to dive into all that different stuff, decking it out, not decking it out, the different techniques for doing rock and rolls. We're going to cover a bunch of different things. I'm here at Dallas Skate Park here in San Diego, one of my favorite skate parks. It's super simple, lots of good transition to learners on. We got small, we got bigger, we got steep, we got mellow. So without further ado, let's jump into how to do rock and rolls on transition. Before I go into some tips and different techniques for doing rock and rolls, I'm gonna get warmed up out here, try some different front side and back side rock and rolls. We're gonna get more into back side rock and rolls in specific, but I will be giving some tips for how to do it front side as well. All right, nice and warmed up. It's pretty cool right now. There's nobody here. It's just dead. Only me. 7 a.m. sessions. That's how you really get in and you learn tricks when nobody else is around. That is the tip for every video I should include, is go to the skate park really early so that you can push on flat and get in nobody's way. So let's get into the first tips of how to do rock and rolls. So the first suggestion I have for learning rock and rolls, we're gonna go into backside rock and rolls first, and then I'll leave some tips for front side rock and rolls. Backside are kind of a fundamental, easier for me. Some people actually have an easier time with front side, so that's skateboarding is subjective. Sometimes front side is easier, sometimes backside's easier. The first tip that I have is finding the right wall to learn it on. So there's really mellow transition that you can see right here, and then there's actually steeper transition behind me. It's an additional, kind of a newer area of the skate park, which has more swoosh factor and has more steep transition. So it's gonna go to vert quicker than this mellow transition where it's kind of more banked out. The tip that I have is learning how to do rock and rolls on something that is steeper. And the reason that I suggest that is that because you can kind of push it up and pull out easier. And I'm gonna get into the details of what I mean by that, so it'll make more sense later in this video. But basically, I think learning how to do rock and rolls on something steep is gonna be easier. It's gonna work to your advantage. Where on something bank, you actually need to know how to do it properly in order to execute it in the right way. And like I always say, there's no right or wrong way to doing skateboard tricks, but I think this might be the one exception on this trick. And what I mean by that, and what I'm referring to, is decking it. And the decking it, what that term comes from is hitting the back of your truck onto the coping, basically hitting your wheels and locking your wheels into that coping area and churning around, versus just landing in the middle of your board and churning, which is easier to do in the beginning when you're first learning how to do rock and rolls. That is something that I did. It took me a long time to figure out how to lock it in and how to deck it. I'm gonna get into that in a second, but that is definitely a beginner thing, because essentially what you can do is just barely go up the transition, kind of tap your board and then turn it back around. If you've never done any kind of rock and roll, the only trick you really need to know how to do before rock and rolls is backside kick turns and maybe backside pivots. That's gonna work to your advantage, but you can use a bank to just learn how to kind of get your wheels over the coping and turn around, doing backside kick turns, but you're stalling it out a lot longer. That's a good way to kind of warm up before you actually start trying it on some transition. Essentially, you constantly want to try to get up like that and then turn in. This, a lot scary, a lot harder. So when I'm referring to decking it, I mean by hitting those wheels back here, right on that coping and churning around. And the reason that's actually easier because it's more of a pivot motion. You're actually able to churn. Where hitting the middle of your board, it's more hectic. You're actually having to do a lot more. So it's kind of one of those things where it's scarier to think about decking it. I have some suggestions in a second, but it is a lot easier because when you're hitting that middle of the board, you're kind of just tapping and you're almost power sliding out of it because there's no real churning point. You have to slide almost when you don't deck it. So that is something I suggest. First thing we're gonna get into is just learning how to deck it. And the first thing that I would say is getting the right amount of speed. Learning on something small enough to where you can push to it, carve to it, whatever it is that you need to do to get the right amount of speed, and getting all the way on top of it. You can get all the way on top of it almost like you're gonna air out. I suggest almost learning that, like how to just get up onto the deck and just stalling on top of the coping, because that is gonna work to your advantage. You're kind of gonna learn how there is that pivot point on a rock and roll, not just on your truck. So your board does have a pivot point as well. The problem when you don't deck it is that gravity is constantly pulling you down. So there's more like zing out factor, swoosh out factor. It's more likely you can like fall onto your back, or just more likely for air. When you deck it, there's more margin for actually pivoting and turning around. So you're using momentum, you're using, I don't know, physics essentially, because you're on top. You kind of shift your body on top of the deck so you're not constantly falling in. That is something that's definitely going to be handy. A good part of rock and roll is actually stalling. It's not trying to do it really quick, because if you stall and you pivot and you turn around, it's going to feel a lot more fluid and you're going to be able to get more comfortable and do it on more wall. Now here's where I put my feet on my board, my foot stance when I do this. I like to have a really wide foot stance because, again, I'm trying to stomp the front of my board up onto the deck while I'm still having a nice pivot area in my back foot. So I try to keep it kind of in that like cut point of my board, not very on the tip of the tail, even though that does happen. It tends to happen once you get into the rock, but when I'm going up to it, I try to keep it in that middle point because I want to use that cut point to really pivot out of that rock and roll. And if I'm too far on my tail, I'm gonna have it's just gonna be too much. I don't want like a huge lift off. I want a really light lift off, because a big lift off and trying to roll back in is gonna be harder, more going on. So you want a little gradual lift off. Something that I also do, and it's not always intentional, sometimes it just happens by accident, but when I'm trying to lift and get into the rock and roll, I actually get on my board and then slide up into the deck position. So that is something that you can do if you want to, or when you're trying to get comfortable with it, is like, you don't have to lock right into the back of your board. When I say deck it, you can almost go into the middle and then keep riding up into your back of your board. I'm not sure if you noticed that, but on some of mine, I have been doing that. And that's a way to kind of get more comfortable with it, so you don't feel like you have to lift your whole board over the deck. You can kind of go in the middle of your board as long as you're still going up, and then you can lock it in. That is a secure way to do it as well. So you don't have to be precise, you don't have to aim it. So from here, it's really all in your shoulders. You have to really kind of like slingshot and pre-plan your shoulders to really get out of the rock and roll. So we talked about how to get up into the rock and roll. Now let's talk about how to get out of it. Now, when you're rolling into it, you want to almost like open up the shoulder. I'm regular footed, so backside, I'm going to open up my left shoulder this way and then kind of pre-swing. So basically, I'm kind of winding myself up. I'm going that way so that I can go even further back to the right. Hopefully that makes sense. But basically the idea is that you kind of turn your shoulder in so that way you could swing it out. And the idea with that is kind of make like a pendulum effect, essentially, kind of like a swing. You want to go up and then pump your way out of that. So you do a lot of that with your shoulders, and when you're locking it in and decking it, that is really going to work to your advantage with this shoulder technique. And all of this kind of comes together. A lot of times tricks have different things that factor in and they make the final output. So yeah, something like that, like really twisting your shoulders and slingshotting them out, as well as just making sure that you have that back chuck sort of bashed against the coping. Ideally, it's not always going to be that way, but just thinking about it that way, you'll work yourself up to that. Because I did the same thing. Like, I landed in the middle of my board, and it was actually Doug Saladino, Pineapple, that told me like, hey man, you got to learn how to deck that board because you're going to slam that way. And what he meant, and he was right, was that when you do a rock and roll in the middle of your board, you have more zing out factors, more likely the transition can zip you out with the board underneath your feet, and you'll fall back onto the transition where you're locking in, you're pivoting, you're using your shoulders. You're able to really control the whole motion of the trick a lot better. Now this next technique is kind of something that comes over time, but it is a style thing, and it actually is a function thing as well. But it's like you kind of eventually dangle your back foot right on the edge of the board. It's almost like you're pushing into the board and your foot is sideways. And the reason that works is because you kind of have your foot sideways like this. This is going to be ridiculous, but I'm going to try to show you that, because when your board comes back up, it levels out. So it's like that, and then it's like that. So the idea with that is like you're almost, again, using your board to your advantage. Just flatten out your board sideways, and as you use the side of your foot to push your board back up, vertical motion, it then levels out with your foot, so then that you can use that to pivot you back in as well. It is a functioning thing. It looks really cool, it's stylish, but it actually does help you quite a lot. So the idea is that as your board comes back up, you deck it, you have your foot kind of on that edge point, and as your board comes back up, it matches back up with the angle of the bottom of your foot. And then you can use that to kind of pendulum and turn yourself back into the transition as well. Now, as far as your body weight goes, I think a lot of this is in your shoulders, like I was saying, but also staying crunched. So you kind of want to stay crunched. And what I mean by crunch is pumping into it. And then as you get to the top, you kind of want to extend your body, let yourself all out, and then stay compressed and pump out of it again. You definitely want to pump out of rock and rolls. You don't want to stay too stiff, because that is a lot of the times when you do get that swinging factor and your board just zings out from underneath your feet. So yeah, staying compressed as you get in, and then as you get to the top, kind of like almost sticking your chest out with those shoulders turned, and then like pumping it back in. So there's a little bit of that like banana to like flatten, opposite banana, back to banana motion will help. All these different techniques are just things that I think about when I'm doing rock and rolls. Over time, it just becomes like muscle memory, and you actually have to think about it more. So I hope you guys enjoy this little video on rock and roll specifics. I actually made another video on how to do backside board slides at this park as well. I'll leave a little link up here above if you want to check that out, if you want to, you know, get your rock and rolls on and then learn how to slide them. Also for frontside, I would say it's a lot of the similar things that I was talking about the backside. The one thing that is different is it's a lot scary because your shoulder and your back is like closed off and you can't really see where you're going in. With that, I'll just say you kind of have to almost not swing as much as I was saying before, and kind of like drop the shoulder so that you can kind of see it and then fall in. It is a lot more of a trust with the frontside rock and roll, but I highly suggest figuring out backside rock and rolls first. Some people figure out frontside, but they're a rare breed. I hope you guys enjoyed this video on rock and rolls, my perspective. Again, skateboarding is so subjective. This is just my tips on how to do them. There is no right and wrong way, but with rock and rolls, there might be a right way, there might be a wrong way. Smash that like button if you enjoyed this video. Subscribe if you're not already. Appreciate all you beautiful subscribers. See you in the next one. MASH.